Oh. Hariom, and greetings from Niagara Falls. I was just listening to a podcast about how half of the refugees in Ukraine are children, and that a lot of effort is being put in for these children to have medical support. Their bruises, their cuts, their breaks. But what everyone is concerned about is their mental health. Right now, I was listening specifically about a teenager. I think he was 15 years old. He was in a car with his mother, and that car went over a landmine. So he saw his mother dying right beside him. What would that do to one's mind? And I'm sharing this with all of us, for all of us to feel grateful. Where you are, what you have, who you are. And that's why we always encourage everyone in our community to have their names written in full, to have their cameras on, so that this gratitude is shared transparently. Prince Arjuna, the Prince Arjuna from the Bhagavad Gita, is not struggling with a capability crisis. He is known as Savyasachi, the one who has no weak hand. He is strong, he is more strong. Yet so many images we see of Prince Arjuna, he's sitting, he's crying. It is because he is struggling with a identity crisis. He doesn't know who he is, so he doesn't know what to do. For more than 14 years, I've been dedicating my time and effort to being with our youth, our high school students, our young adults, our college students, our evolving adults, those who are now working and relating and so on. And I feel our youth, young adults, evolving adults are very much like Prince Arjuna. They do not lack qualification. When people introduce me and they talk about my education, it takes half a breath because there's so little there. Our youth and young adults and evolving adults are far more qualified than I am. But what is missing is direction. What to do with this qualification, how to use this. And this is why our community is very much about Marga Darshaka. Marga Darshaka means guides towards the path. Now, I'm not describing myself, I'm describing our community. We have many Marga Darshakas like Power Hour, a class just for youth. Deep Space, which is just for our young adults, and our mentorship program. Obviously, I was building up to this. I go into a discourse on Ramayana right now. Our mentorship program is one of the most comprehensive offerings that our community shares. There are many Marga Darshakas. Like when you're hiking, sometimes there's an overt sign, go this way. Sometimes you see a trail, more people have gone this way, so you go this way. That's what our community and specifically the mentorship program is about. We have a dynamic team. We have dynamic advisors. They're all Margadarshikas. And this evening, what our community and program is going to focus on is meaning. The more meaning one has in their life, the less stress they have in their lives. Think about a movie that you watched recently that has no meaning. It's stressful. What should I eat during this movie? I'm wasting my time right now. But if you're watching a movie that has a lot of meaning, you don't feel that stress. You feel that relief. Our workshop is going to be facilitated by my friends Rachana and my friend Parag. Both of them I have known for more than a decade. They've been seeking sincerely for more than a decade, at least in my reference. Both of them have been serving for more than a decade. Both of them teach Balavihar in different capacities. And the point that you really want to hear is that they're both trained professionally in helping us with our mental health. Aspects of that, stress, anxiety. Rachana is one of our advisors in a direct way. Parag is one of our direct advisors in an indirect way because his wife is. They are inseparable, legally, physically, so on. And one more note that they may not talk about, both of them are parents. Being a parent is a comprehensive experience, so they have that too. With this, our friends, Rachana and Parag, will continue.
Hari Om, Vivekji Pranam, and thank you so much for just the fact that this platform exists and the fact that we can have these really important conversations. And you started very heavy with Ukraine, and we will take it down multiple notches and not talk about such adverse childhood events right now, but still talk about stress and really hopefully talk about it in a way that is of use and value to everybody that's here today. So I just wanted to start throwing out a couple of thoughts in the mind and then give a little bit of a general overview. And then I look forward to inviting Parag to come and speak in a lot more depth as well. So when we think about stress, really just kind of thinking about what is stress and is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Innately, does it have that quality about it? And then are there things that we can do sort of from a preventative standpoint that can help make us a little bit stronger in how we can cope with stress and how we can keep ourselves stronger? So just in thinking about what is stress, stress really is not innately a good or bad thing. It's just that physical or that mental reaction that we have to some external source. So whether that regardless of what that external source is, it's that physiologic change that is happening in our body that's making our heart rate go up and making our respiratory rate go up, or, making our muscles tense and kind of that feeling that we get. But at the same time, that stress or those hormones that are getting released, they also make us able to concentrate better. We're able to focus a little bit more. We have the energy to pull the all-nighters and the things that sometimes we do when we're feeling stress. So stress by itself isn't necessarily innately good or bad, but what might be a positive stress for one person may be a toxic stress for another. And again, maybe not to the level that, we're seeing with so many people across the world, but really just kind of thinking about it in our own personal day-to-day. So when we talk about positive stress, and I do feel that there is a possibility to have positive stress in life, I think that this is a time where you may have that brief increase in your heart rate, and you may have those stress hormones that are being released, but they're short-lived. And when the stress passes, and when, there's a feeling of growth on the other side. So Vivekji was saying today that he scored a goal with his left foot, right? So when you're at these sports events or when you're at these competitions and things like that, there is that feeling your heart is racing, and not just because you're running, but there's that feeling of that adrenaline rush. And that can be a really positive stress that at the end of you feel like, okay, I accomplished something and I feel really good about it. Even when you're learning a new skill, when you learn how to drive on the highway for the first time. I remember the first time my son came out of the car after driving on the highway, he was so because he was so tense from driving like that. He came out and he's like, Mom, my muscles are hurting. But he was so focused. And then, when he came out and he said, okay, I did it. I didn't hit anybody and I did it. The next time that he had to go and he had to drive, he had the sense of accomplishment, or the sense of, empowerment that I can do this. So there is a positive stress that can be, something that leads to a growth experience. And this is something that, when you face an adversity and you feel stronger from it, it's not necessarily a bad thing for us, and we can develop resilience in that environment. But at the same time, there are so many stressors in our lives that are not positive, and maybe they could be tolerable stress, or maybe they really are toxic stress. And when they're there for extended periods of time, they can really become a chronic stress that can lead to illness and be harmful for our body over time. And so as a pediatrician, we oftentimes really focus on what can we do preventative. So my hope today is really just to share some coping techniques that are sort of readily available techniques that we can use to be able to practice when our body and our mind are calm, so that they become sort of like a muscle memory. So when you do have that time of stress, it's automatically available for you, and you just kind of bring that muscle memory into it and use those techniques. And so my hope is that during this hour that we're spending together, that you're able to walk away with at least one or two coping techniques that you feel comfortable using and that you have available to you, so that if you do have these short-term episodes of stress that are brought on by external stimuli, you feel like you've got something in your tool belt that's kind of helpful for you. And so, we all experience stress at different times. For me, public speaking is a huge stressor. And so when Vivekji asks me to come and speak at these things, like my heart starts racing like weeks in advance, and my heart starts pounding, and you may be able to feel that on the other side of Zoom. And so just for a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you to get into my head and feel that your heart is racing, and feel that your respiratory rate is up, and feel that like your tummy is going around in circles, like there's butterflies there, and your muscles are tense. And when you're feeling that much tension or that much stress or that much physiologic change in your body, this is something I want to do so I can bring my own sense down and see if all of you can kind of experience it with me. So I'm going to ask Brahim, if you don't mind, Brahim, can you play this video for me, please?
To help calm a busy mind, start by taking several slow, deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. Next, use your 5 senses to notice the things around you. What are 5 things you see? No matter how big or small, near or far, notice 5 things you see around you. Do you notice a certain color, a certain shape, a comforting item? Next, notice 4 things you can touch. Do you notice the texture of the seat beneath you, the fabric of your shirt, the texture of an object you can hold in your hand? Now notice 3 things you can hear. What is the noise closest to you? What is the noise furthest away? Notice what noises are loudest and which ones are softest. Next, notice two things you can smell. Is the smell strong? Is it faint? Do you recognize it? And finally, notice one thing you can taste. Maybe a mint you have in your mouth, or the lingering taste of a snack you had earlier. Now take another deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Notice how your body feels after completing this exercise. Are you relaxed? Does your mind feel calmer? How do you feel?
So thank you all for doing that with me, because I automatically notice for myself as I can feel my heart rate gradually coming down. That for me, grounding is really, really just very helpful in treating stress. In the short term, obviously it does not take care of everything, but in the short term, when you're just trying to reverse those physiologic changes, it's really good at just kind of flipping that back and bringing that heart rate down and that respiratory rate down. The other thing that I think is really neat about grounding is that you literally can do this anywhere, anytime. So you can do it in the middle of a public speaking event. If you're sitting in a lecture hall, you're about to take an exam, if you're giving a presentation at work and you just need to be able to calm yourself down. Grounding is a great, great technique to be able to just be in the moment. And when you're in the moment, automatically all of these physiologic changes, they start happening. Your heart rate starts to come down, your respiratory rate starts to come down. And with that, that stress reaction, it's really just a physiologic reaction. That reaction starts to come down. And no matter where you are, if you have 5 seconds, if you have 10 seconds, if you have 30 seconds, this happened to be 2 minutes, you can get yourself in touch with whatever is going around you with your senses and be able to use that as a way to just ground yourself. So, similar to grounding techniques, there's so many other techniques that we can use, and we can share some of those websites with you at the end of the talk. There's so many different coping mechanisms that are out there. So, something may work for one person, something else may work for somebody else. And these are really not meant to take the place of a healthcare specialist if somebody has anxiety or depression, but can be really, really useful when you're noticing these physiologic changes that come with acute stress. And over time, if we use that in a preventative way, it can really keep our body healthier physically and mentally both. And so as kind of an introduction to this topic of stress and anxiety, and sharing just one of the coping mechanisms that I love, that I use often, and I encourage my family members and my patients both to use often. I just wanted to share that with all of you today. So thank you for being a part of that with me. And with that, I'm super excited to listen to Parag. And there was one thing that I thought was really neat about Parag, which I think Vivekji partially mentioned already. So along with being a child and adolescent psychiatrist in Chicago area for the last 12 years, Parag was actually a Balvihar student at Badri from the age of 5. And when he graduated from Balvihar and went and finished all of his professional training, he came back as a teacher, Balvihar teacher at Badri, and now is doing Seva at a much bigger scale for Chinmay Mission. And so I thought that was really neat. And Parag, if you want to go ahead and take over from here.
Hari Om, and thank you, Rachana, and then pranams to Vivekji and to everyone here. And I think it's very appropriate that we're having this discussion at night on a Sunday, because we can think of just how, in terms of stress, what is the most stressful part of the given week? It's probably right now, just kind of getting prepped up for whatever's happening tomorrow. And today I just want to kind of take over from where Rachana left off and really talk more deeply about the idea of stress and coping and just more what's happening when we kind of work through stress. And so, and we can and Brian, thank you for setting up the slides. And I'll just kind of go through a few slides just to kind of talk about certain things, then really want to get into another exercise, doing some additional stress management, and then and really opening up to Q&A, which I think is where we can have just a really interesting discussion going forward. And so, so to kind of jump off of what Rachana was saying, what is stress? There's a word that comes up a lot when you look into research on stress, and that word is homeostasis. And I'm sure those of us in the medical field have heard this time and time again, but it's this ability of an organism to maintain internal environment despite changes from the outside. And that's all that that is. You can define that in many, many different ways. But for example, you're about to leave on, it's Friday afternoon, you're going to go home for the day after work, and suddenly, nope, we have a project, your boss comes in, and we have a project we have to do, you got to stay late, you got to come in Saturday. Your external environment changed, and then whatever happens internally, you get thrown off balance. How you go back on balance is stress management. So the stressor is the environmental change that leads to the internal changes that arise, and then the stress management is how do we get back to our state of homeostasis? How do we get back to a state of balance? And so there's just feedback at a biological level. There's just feedback mechanisms that are constantly going inside of us. And for example, temperature, right? So take a second, and we're all probably sitting in very comfortable rooms right now. But take a second to kind of just notice the temperature that you're experiencing right now. We often don't notice it until it's either too cold or too hot. But our body is constantly getting information. Our skin is constantly getting information from the environment about, is this temperature, what is the humidity, what's the temperature itself. And if say you touch a hot stove, you sort of set up a chain reaction of events that occurs very quickly. So that's part of that homeostasis. We're kind of watching the environment. Our body underlying unconsciously is sort of watching the environment and then adjusting accordingly. Fluid balance, blood sugar, these are toxin exposure. These are all sort of ways that our body gets, and our mind actually gets knocked off of homeostasis. And that's the stressor. How we manage that is our stress management. So next slide, please. So this is I won't talk about this very much, but what was happening kind of underlying this management of homeostasis. A couple of these I want to highlight. So at the very top, that sort of blue shaded area is what we call the limbic system in the brain. And it's one of the central areas that is a bridge between our body and our higher mind. And so it sort of is telling us all the time. I'm sure you've heard the word amygdala very frequently. It's sort of telling us all the time what's going down, what's happening down below. And how we interpret that is critical. So we get all this information coming up, like say suddenly it got really cold in the room. Our body sort of acts, adrenaline kind of kicks in, we have a cortisol response, all these sort of things happen. What happens up in sort of the brainstem, right around here, where the amygdala and the hippocampus are, it sets up the rest of our mind, the rest of our brain, our higher level centers to really start making decisions. And so don't get into this too deeply, but just wanted to kind of throw out some terms, which we'll kind of talk about in just a little bit. So next slide, please. So the body senses that homeostasis is being disrupted. We release adrenaline and cortisol, and a lot happens very quickly. Our heart rate goes up, our blood vessels dilate in muscles, it constricts in the digestive system and the reproductive system, and all this happens on the order of seconds. Basically, our body's kind of getting ready to act. Our muscles are getting tense, and we're ready to sort of do something. So when you notice, you're walking down the dark pathway and suddenly a bush starts to shake, you might notice this situation happening where you start to kind of feel really tense. You're very alert to what's happening around you. And that's very helpful, right? Because in case that bush shaking is actually a tiger, that is a problem and you need to deal with that ASAP. The problem is in our modern society, though, we're not really running from tigers most of the time. Hopefully not at all. And so the idea is that we have this reaction that occurs that's very, very, very helpful in life and death situations, but that occurs for situations that don't really call for it. And if that happens frequently, then we start to get some serious problems occur. And so I mentioned, the limbic system, the amygdala and the hippocampus up in the brain, all this stuff is happening kind of in our body, in our brainstem. The amygdala sort of decides, okay, we're noticing a lot of activity happening, right? We're noticing our breathing is going up, or our pupils are dilating. All this is happening. Is this excitement or is this terror? That's the decision that we have to start to make, and how we respond to that, how we decide that. Is this going to be excitement? Is this going to be terror? It sort of differentiates between what is distress versus what is eustress, what is really frightening versus what is really exciting. And so after that response occurs, which often again occurs on the scale of minutes, then we have rest and digest taking over. And the term we use in medicine is a parasympathetic nervous system takes over. We start to relax, our digestion occurs again, reproductive system occurs again. We sort of are able to, in animals, you tend to see them just really kind of relax. But in humans, though, again, it's not so simple. One, because the stressors that lead to this reaction aren't necessarily being chased by a predator. And for us, we don't just sort of end there. Once the predator finishes chasing the gazelle, the gazelle isn't really thinking about the lion again. It's done with that whole scenario. But my boss gave me a bunch of work I have to do over this weekend. I'm going to be thinking about that all weekend, and I'll be just ruminating on that, thinking about it again and again and again. And so the rest and digest doesn't really have a chance to set in, unlike, say, the classical stressor of, I'm being chased by something. So next slide, please. And so how does that relate to our psychology? So that's kind of a basic sort of overview of the biology that happens. And we get homeostasis. We have a sort of sense of balance that gets knocked off by something in the environment or internally. Our body responds, and then our brain responds. And then the higher level self, has to make a decision on what to do about that. And so as Rachana was saying, this is a reaction that's occurring constantly. And so stress and the stress response is not inherently good or bad. And it's a very key thought, because that kind of changes how we can look into stress, or how we sort of incorporate stress into our lives. There's a way to go about stress management of really embracing stress, of really looking at it as something that we are seeking in some ways. In some ways, perhaps too much in thrill seeking, but to look at it as not necessarily inherently a negative thing. Now, what Vivek had mentioned at the beginning, say with the example of Ukraine, if you're living in a dangerous environment, or if you have a history of abuse or neglect, if there's just a baseline level of safety that's not been established, then your level of stress at baseline will be higher. But for those of us who've been very fortunate to grow up in a more safe environment, we have the ability to really change, to raise and reduce our stress level very consciously. And that's, I think, where we want to go next in terms of talking about stress management. And so just real quick, though, a question of, what situations do you have in your own life? And this is something maybe kind of to mull over for a second, that disrupt that balance, that disrupt that homeostasis. How do you seek out stress? Any in the chat, any examples that you can think of? I gave one example already in that picture there. I think, when you go on a roller coaster, basically, horror movies. So think about what happens, zip lining, skydiving. Think about what happens in any of those activities. So what's happening to your heart rate, when that drop occurs in a roller coaster, it's very uncomfortable, right? You talk about volunteering for Seva. Think about that feeling that's there. Now we seek out that experience, right? We are actually trying to really drive that in our lives. Now that's not any different from the stress response to the body, right? The body can't really differentiate between being chased by a tiger or skydiving. It really kind of thinks, okay, in both cases we're in dire straits here. The difference is that conscious control, and that's where we have a lot of ability to make some significant impact on how we perceive stress, and kind of really turning towards stress and making it something that we can really sort of take charge of in our lives. So next slide, please. So benefits, and Rachana was talking about this a bit earlier. So what happens with stress? Why is stress good, or why is stress something that we might actually want to seek out in certain specific, very narrow cases? So it improves memory. So basically, neuronal development occurs, especially dendritic development occurs during periods of stress. So the nerves that you have, the connectivity between those nerves increases. Our focus goes up, our alertness goes up. Which, imagine, if you're, say, being the kind of classic stress issue, you're being chased by a predator, you want to be alert in that moment. It enhances our immune response. And so one of the big stressors that classically before the modern age we would experience as humans is sickness and injury. And so whenever any of that happens, our stress level goes up, and that kicks in a very strong immune response to really protect ourselves against any further harm. Now, when short-term stress turns into long-term stress, that's where the real problem lies. And so what are the consequences of that? So memory starts to deteriorate. It also becomes harder to remember things, or create new memories, I should say. So you can imagine, we see this with students all the time, and in practice, I work with a lot of individuals who struggle with school, for example, and they'll often procrastinate, and that leads to, they get the work done technically, but then later on, they have a test and they have no idea what they studied. Because when you're under stress, especially long-term stress, the ability to gather information and store it in the long-term memory is reduced. In a larger time scale, chronic fatigue, insomnia, stress is believed to be the #1 cause of insomnia in the world, really. More than all the other biological factors which may cause insomnia. It's stress. And I think we've all been there before. We're kind of up at night, and where our minds are kind of thinking about something, or what's happening the next day, or something going on, and we just can't get to sleep. And why is that? Because, as you mentioned way earlier in that very complicated slide I showed, adrenaline is coursing through our veins when we are experiencing stress. And you can imagine, if you're sort of jacked up on adrenaline, you're not going to be able to really sleep. And over long-term chronic stress very commonly leads to depression. And you can imagine all the effects on the system. And again, short-term, the increase in alertness, and the heart rate goes up, and the breathing gets very shallow and rapid. If that occurs for too long, you start to get some serious medical problems as well. So heart disease, strokes, obesity, high blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's one of the main causes for medical complications in the world. And so it makes every medical condition that you have much harder to work through. The next slide, please. So let's talk about managing stress. And as I mentioned before, it kind of two differences that we have as people, as humans, from the animals around us. And we have this sort of ancient stress system that's built in. We're the only ones who understand the dimension of time, really, at least from what we understand, that we are able to look into the future, we're able to think about the past, and a lot of our stresses lie in those two dimensions. The here and now stress may not be all that strong, but then I'm worried about what's happening tomorrow, or I'm worried about what's happening in 10 years. That's a stress that, if it kind of builds, that's what's going to kill us over time, which we don't really share that trait with other animals. And so I tend to break it down in time. So in managing stress, we have 3 time scales that we're talking about. And corresponding to that, techniques that help kind of work for those 3 time scales. So short-term, very narrow focus, short-term stress, focus on biological techniques. Like we mentioned, grounding techniques, deep breathing techniques, things like that. They really help quite a bit for the short-term stress. That's I'm taking an exam now, in the next hour perhaps, and I just need to perform as well as I can, but I'm really stressed going into this exam. Or I'm public speaking right now. How do I sort of deal with this at this moment? Biological techniques for short-term stress. Expanding that a bit, psychological techniques and social techniques for longer-term, medium-term stress. And I'll explain, the timescales that we're talking about here in a minute. But so think biology for short-term. Right now I have this problem. psychological social techniques for medium-term stress, which is actually where most of our kind of stressed out, feelings occur. But the deepest and most valuable for long-term stress is spiritual development, as Vicky had mentioned at the beginning. And so we'll talk about all these three. So I wanted to just kind of introduce this idea of three timelines, three aspects of stress on three different timelines. Because again, we're the only creatures that we know of that really can understand time. And time is a critical factor for stress, right? It's all about context, it's all about duration. So next slide, please. Short term. So let's talk about what that means. Seconds to hours to maybe a day. I don't know where the why went. And we can kind of take a look at this. This is the short term, I'm taking a test right now or in a couple hours, up to about a day worth of time duration. This is where we can really embrace stress, because if it's a short term, this isn't sort of I'm thinking about being stressed for 3-5 years, being stressed for this day because I have this project I have to do. I can manage that stress, and that stress will actually help with my alertness. And so, a couple techniques or a few techniques that can be pretty helpful there. Deep breathing, and this is very common. I think we all have heard this before. And it's a beautiful technique because we can practice it anywhere. Much like grounding, we can actually practice this anywhere we want. And it really does make a difference. And so one recommended breathing technique, which does have a good deal of data behind it, is so breathing through the nose, so nasal breathing with a long exhale through the mouth. And we'll practice this in a little bit actually together, or in a breakout session. But achieving 6 breaths per minute appears to have a great deal of stress reduction success. There's been a number of studies looking at 12 breaths per minute, 10. It seems like 6 is kind of that sweet spot where you get the greatest reduction in stress overall for acute stress. And then a few other techniques that can help. One is softening the gaze. I really like this one. It's becoming more popular. I think recently I've been hearing about it a lot more. But this is one we can actually all do right now. So how this works is we first close your eyes, and if you want to practice this at home, gently close your eyes. Or you can touch the sides of your eyes just to kind of get yourself feeling sort of grounded where you are. And then open your eyes, but don't look at the computer screen or the phone or whatever you're using to log into Zoom. Maybe look beyond that. And keep your eyes steady right in front of you. And gradually start to notice, without moving your eyes or without moving your head, start to notice more and more of what's in your peripheral vision. You kind of pay close attention to whatever arises from your peripheral vision. And then notice how you're feeling as you're doing this. If anyone wants to put in the chat just their experience with that, please go ahead. What's often experienced is a sense of calming. And what the thought behind this is that in bigness, I like that, instantly calming. In stress, in these moments of stress, we have a tunnel vision, which makes sense, right? Because again, our stress response is an ancient response that developed, instantaneously refreshing. It developed to really avoid predators, right? This is avoid, or warring other tribes or what have you. And so in a moment of stress, you want to focus on exactly what you are fighting, basically. Allowing yourself to experience peripheral vision is more what we experience. So say we're scanning the environment and looking at the bigger picture. So you're sort of telling your biology, essentially, from top down. You're telling your biology through your eyes to say, no, we're not fighting a tiger right now. We're just expanding the horizon. We're looking at the African veldt. We're looking at the large picture of the mountains. And so you can sort of notice your anxiety start to reduce really quickly. The next technique is the Valsalva maneuver. And I don't recommend this if you have any sort of heart issues, breathing trouble, because there is a possibility this may be harmful. And so I'll state what this is. Let's not practice this one right now. Basically, it's bearing down, and what that means is, so basically, when you go to the bathroom, that feeling of when you really have to go and you're expelling all the waste, that feeling for about 5 seconds. And so you take a deep breath first, and then you bear down for about 5 seconds, and then like you're going to the bathroom, and then breathe out So breathe in 5 seconds, bear down for 5 seconds, and then breathe out. If you don't have any history of any cardiac problems, if you feel free to give it a try. It's often used actually in delivery, labor and delivery, to kind of help kind of working through childbirth, but to try to reduce overall stress during that process. And then the other one is fake yawning. This is one I recently came across, which I really kind of like. So there's one theory behind, I don't think anyone really knows why we yawn biologically, but one theory is that it's a way for the lungs to expel carbon dioxide. And when you do, so how do you fake yawn? And by doing this, oftentimes you actually yawn afterwards, but you open your mouth really wide, of course, and you start to make an R sound, like ah. And when you do that, yeah, you'll start to instantly start to relax. And as you know, yawns are contagious, and so there's some belief that this evolved for groups of people, or perhaps even animals, to calm each other down during periods of stress. So if someone yawns, then someone else yawns, and then everyone's kind of expelling carbon dioxide. Again, this is a theory. I don't think anyone's proved this whatsoever, but this is the theory behind it, is that then we sort of expel carbon dioxide together, so we all kind of collectively reduce our anxiety. So it's one that, as long as you're not in class and gonna offend anybody, you can do anytime. The next slide, please. So that was short term. So up to about a day, short term stress, managing intense anxiety, biological techniques. So now let's move to medium term. So what I define that as days to weeks to maybe months, usually days and weeks. And this is what we tend to think of when we think of stressed out. I'm stressed out because, problems at work, or I'm stressed out with relationship stressors, or I'm stressed that this is the time scale that tends to occur. So how do we cope with that? How do we sort of cope better with that? The first is to really build up exercise and sleep habits. And this is critically important. Now that you could say, I'm cheating because those are biological, but yes, they are. But they are also powerful ways to kind of organize one's day. You say you wake up and you start exercising, you work out every day in the morning at this time. You sort of starting off the day with control over your life. Now, whatever happens after that may be completely out of your control, but at least you're sort of starting off your sense with a sense of, I got this. I'm able to have some message of my, some part of my life that's under my control. And so it's about establishing this locus of control. What do I control in this situation? And then acceptance of whatever you cannot control. And that's a critical part. Now, it's a very difficult thing to do sometimes. We have to accept that I take this test, and whatever result is under my control. I can just do the best that I can. As Gurudev always says, do the best and leave the rest, right? It's a powerful, powerful statement. So for mild to moderate stress, the sense of how can I wrest more control out of the situation, right? I can control that I wake up at this time. I can control that I am going to go for a run. I can control certain things in my life, and then everything else that's out of my sphere of control, I just accept that that's out of my sphere of control. Part of that is also looking out for things that might actually make that process more difficult, and that's where the shoulds become a problem. I should work out. I should do this. I should do that. That can actually increase stress. So it's about doing those things, not necessarily worrying about, okay, should I go? I should have gone for a run this morning and I didn't, or I should get more sleep. It's about actually doing okay, I'm going to put my phone down. I'm going to go to a quiet place. I'm going to perhaps meditate. I'm going to allow myself to actually sleep properly. And then, as I mentioned before, it's about interpretation. So when I feel that tension in my body, when I feel my heart rate going up, if I interpret that as excitement, it just changes how I gather that information and what I do with that information going forward. The body is telling me, the amygdala one thing, the amygdala is saying, okay, is this terror or is this excitement? I make the choice consciously that I'm going to interpret this as excitement. I'm going to interpret this as something I'm going to jump into. And it's in that interpretation, that's what we have real control over in that moment. It just changes the next step that you take. This is kind of the more psychological dimension. And so next slide, please. And so still within that medium term, so days to weeks, maybe up to months, is the social aspect of it. And this is, especially this day and age, is critically important. This idea of fostering ideally in-person social connection. Mentorship is absolutely one way to do that. And then also limiting time online, especially with social media. There's a lot more research now that indicates, and especially since about 2010, 2011, since social media began to erupt, that rates of anxiety, depression, especially in adolescence, is going up, skyrocketing. This idea of, I believe that I'm connected to people on social media, but I'm not really. Your Facebook friends are really just characters on a screen, or the Instagram likes are not really anything. It's just they're just digits. It has nothing to do with reality necessarily. And so making as much of a conscious effort to foster in-person communication, or if it's going to be online, then through video ideally, or phone, not through just sending text, things like that. And then and this is going to be going back to what Vivekji was talking about at the beginning, is examining one's goodness of fit between the self and environment. What are our values and what drives our path forward? This is often a discussion I've been having recently, especially in the last couple of years, with a lot of medical providers. Part of what I do is I work with medical providers, nurses, and others that have been going through just an unprecedented amount of stress in the last couple of years. And they're burning out, basically. And a lot of that burnout comes from a sense of they just don't believe that their environment, that there's not a goodness of fit between myself and the environment. What I do now isn't consistent with my values. I went into this profession because I wanted to help people, and I'm not able to help people now. And those are hard questions to ask, because oftentimes we have a great deal of fear of changing course in our lives. We have a great deal of fear of stepping away and saying, maybe I shouldn't be a nurse anymore, right? I worked for so many years, and part of my identity is based on this. And I had this belief that I was going to make a change. But what I'm doing is not matching my value. And I have to make a decision to say, I cannot do that anymore. Or I have to set some boundaries with people, even if those are people that I care about. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But that's that path. And that's a way to sort of reduce overall stress in general over the medium term. Not an easy question. This is often something that we can't do this in a breakout session, because this is something that we have to really sort of think deeply on and contemplate for a long period of time, and accept that there's going to be a lot of pain with that process. But hopefully, working through that process, working through those questions, you come out on the other side with a much more clear and solid goodness of fit between yourself and the environment. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the deepest level of stress management, and this is spiritual stress management in the long term. So years to lifetimes, perhaps plural lifetimes. The sense of who am I in this world? I'm here. I came here. I don't remember why I came here, but I am here. What is it that I'm supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to be? Those questions, those deeper questions, working through that creates less stress on all the other levels, all the other time scales, right? So the greater one's spiritual development is there, the less that you have medium and short-term stress too, because the external environment is not going to affect you as much. It's emphasizing service to oneself, to one's community, to the world as a whole. Cultivating gratefulness is time and time again has been shown in I don't know how many research studies to show that it makes a significant improvement in both anxiety management, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. Seeing one's role as a temporary player in a game. I love this example that I often talk about with kids that are under a lot of stress. I can say, imagine yourself with a grandparent, and you're playing a game of whatever it may be, checkers, chess, whatever you can decide. What is that child focused on at that moment? They're focused on winning. They want to win that game. What is the grandparent focused on? It's not winning. They don't really care about this silly chess game. They just want to spend that time with that child, right? They're looking at this from a much different perspective. And I think even young kids can get that. Because they've all played games with their grandparents and they know it's different for them. So even I could talk to a 6-year-old and they kind of clicks in their mind of seeing oneself in a different role, or sort of expanding that role out. And then that's the idea of expanding to the largest perspective we can on whatever is stressing us out. And so cultivating humility, cultivating compassion for others. One technique with that is imagining yourself first, oftentimes. You could also consider a loved one, because sometimes it's actually hard to have compassion for oneself. Many people struggle with that, actually. So imagining someone you care for as a small child or even a baby, and just giving them all that love and compassion, and then expanding that out to others. So then maybe expanding that to yourself to say, if say I'm ruminating a lot, I'm worried about something, or I'm feeling just burnt out, I'm going to imagine myself as a baby and give myself all that love. And then eventually you can actually expand that compassion to those who stress you out. So that person that's causing the problem potentially, like seeing them as a child and seeing them as they're just trying to figure things out. This is how they've grown up, and this is how they've learned to be in the world. And it's grating to you, of course, but that seeing that from the source can kind of take the intensity of that stress level down in that moment. So just to review real quick, we can look at it from 3 different time scales: short-term, biological; medium-term, psychological, kind of examining what one's goals are, and also social connection; and then long-term, and the deepest level of stress management is spiritual development. So next slide, please. And so now we'd like to do a breakout room activity. And Prem, you might need to help me with this one. So what we'd like to do is to get into small groups of 2.
Sure. Yeah, groups of 2 to 3. I think we'll cap it to 5 minutes or so. So a few things. The first thing is to just discuss a short-term issue that's stressing you at the moment. What are the signs that you're stressed, and how have you been responding to the stressor so far? Then please take a minute to try a breath work technique, which is the one that Parag described, where you inhale through your nose for 2 seconds, hold your breath for 2 seconds, and then breathe out for 6 seconds. And then if there's time at the end, just reflect on how you felt after the breath. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you found this breakout room meaningful. I'll start by thanking our speakers today, Rachana and Parag, for their messages about stress and how to cope with that. I think some of the techniques are really practical, and so I'm looking forward to applying it to my daily grind as well. So I really appreciate all the insights there. I have a few announcements before we can formally close, and then we'll stay on for some Q&A, which is optional. So the first thing, a couple announcements just related to the mentorship program. So if you are unmatched, please hang tight. We are still working on matches, so we have not forgotten about you. We'll be in touch soon. The second thing is we are currently updating the permission settings on the stamp card. So that may remain locked for the next day or so. Going forward, only mentors will be able to access the card. And so mentors should be responsible for keeping it updated. The next thing is our community has been rallying to support critical food assistance at the Ukrainian border for fleeing refugees. The last time I saw the news, I believe over 3 million refugees have fled Ukraine. So this cause is highly pressing. In just 1 week, we have raised $12,333, and we'll complete this effort in 4 days on Thursday, March the 24th, which is exactly 1 month into the war. And we are hoping that we can get this figure up to $18,001. Please follow the link in the chat to make your contribution to this important cause. Final 2 announcements. The first one is that in-person retreats are back. So July the 8th to the 10th, DC is having its first in-person Chick Setukai retreat in over 2 years. So please save the date. And then final one is next month is Earth Month. And so our community is embarking on an effort to plant 1,000 trees. Please stay tuned for more details on this, which will be shared in the upcoming days. With that, I believe we can formally conclude. I will turn to Vivek for the Shanti part, after which everyone is welcome to stay on for some Q&A with our speakers, or you're welcome to leave as well. Harry on.
Lovely, Prem. And I am correcting Prem. I shared it in the chat. Right now, our community has raised $13,942 on our way to 18,001, as Prem has shared. And Prem is very much an ambassador of giving his resources and time and effort in so many directions. So I'm glad he spoke about this. How are all of you? How are you pre-workshop and how are you post-workshop? Can I see? You know, those corny like hand gestures where someone's angry and their face goes up like, like that. So let me see your smiles. All of the stress has been released. All of the anxiety has been released. How are you? Good. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Be safe, be sound, be serene, be joy, and personalize this workshop.